carrying on reviewing Autism and Asperger's Syndrome in Children by Dr. Luke Beardon. Another thing that Luke says in the book is that we should not compare ourselves against the predominant neurotype, because this can lead to a poor sense of self. So that autistics should not be comparing themselves to non-autistics, or parents should not be comparing their autistic children to non-autistic children. Absolutely, because it's a false comparison, and that's just going to make you feel down. However, I would also say that, and Luke Beardon doesn't address this in the book, but it's very important, that you should also be not comparing yourself against other autistics. And I say this because I do this myself. I've done it a lot since my diagnosis. Once I got diagnosed autistic, I was no longer comparing myself to non-autistics because, false comparison. It was a kind of a release from that, as it were. But again, the problem was that I started to compare myself to other autistics. And I still do this. And I think it's probably quite natural because I think we all compare ourselves to our peer group. And of course, other autistic people now are my peer group. And when I say other autistics, I'm talking about people who would have been diagnosed more with the Asperger's type of autism when Asperger's was still there. I don't compare myself to, say, non-verbal autistics because they're a different league altogether and, have different challenges to me. I'm talking about people with autism who are verbal like myself. I compare myself to them. Particularly those who I see as being more successful than myself. For example, those who are in work, maybe have more conventional lives, like are able to have relationships, maybe are married or have children or are in work and don't need to rely on state benefits and seem to just be coping better than me, coping in inverted commas. This is really unhelpful, but I can't help it, and I think I do it because we always compare ourselves, keeping up with Joneses, as they say, you compare yourself to your peer group. Even though I don't actually really want a relationship, it's not something I actually really want. I'd like to be able to work, but unfortunately I can't because of the nature of my disabilities. So I end up comparing myself. And obviously they always say, don't they, that the grass is always greener on the other side, which I am aware of, and their lives might not be as perfect as they look. But I can't help comparing myself against it because they seem to have more quote-unquote normal seeming lives. But it's not helpful. But this isn't often addressed in books. It's always treated as though now you're diagnosed autistic, you find your tribe, and there's this great sense of collective solidarity. In my experience, that's not actually the case. I haven't found a sense of collective solidarity amongst other autistics. I think because we're such a diverse group of people, it's very difficult to find a sense of solidarity when everyone is so diverse, and when actually your needs then are actually often quite different. My needs are very different to an autistic person who's able to work and live a conventional life. You might not understand what it's like to be on benefits, for example. I have more solidarity with other people on benefits, regardless of whether or not they're autistic. I think it is important not to compare ourselves to other autistic people, although we do anyway, because in a sense it's quite natural. So on page 38, as I mentioned in my previous video, this is something that Luke Beardon brings up. So he talks about how autism is not behaviour. Behaviour might seem to be unusual, but the child might be happy. So an autistic child might be displaying very unusual behaviour, and other people might be noticing that behaviour and kind of be bothered by it, but the child themselves might actually be very, very happy. But conversely, the child might present in the same way as someone as the predominant neurotype, and yet have enormous problems. And I actually think that's a really important point, actually. So, for example, when I was a child, I did display quite inappropriate behaviour. I wasn't diagnosed as a child, I was diagnosed as an adult, but I displayed very inappropriate behaviour when I was a child that caused other people concerns. My parents were concerned about my behaviour, school was concerned about my behaviour, because my parents often had to go into school. Teachers were always saying I was messing around in class, I wasn't listening, I was just walking around the classroom, I was annoying other children. And I was quite inappropriate, but I was a very happy child. I was a very happy child. I had a good childhood. I caused other people problems and concerns, but I was a very happy child. However, now, as an adult, while, I'm not unhappy, but I display less, my behaviour is now more quote-unquote normal. Other people might not notice that I'm different because I've learned how to kind of fit in and blend in. And yet I actually have more problems now than I did when I was a kid, in terms of the impact on my anxiety and other things that affect me. So I actually very much agree with Luke Beardon that it's very important to see beyond behaviour and ask yourself, is the child or the adult, do they have problems that need to be addressed? They might be displaying lots of flapping, lots of behaviour that draws attention to them, but actually if they're happy and they don't have any anxiety, does it actually matter? No. So autism is not behaviour, it's a brain problem, or a brain, quote unquote, often it's a problem, but, that's a very personal thing, I should add. It's a problem for some, maybe not for others, because it's a very personal thing, but it's rooted in the brain anyway. So on page 39 he talks about the issue when a non-autistic person says to an autistic person, oh, I'm a little bit like that too. That's very offensive, by the way. That is not done. If you're non-autistic, do not say that to an autistic person. It's one of the most offensive things you could ever say. Do not say, I'm a bit like that too. It's in that one sentence, you immediately demean and trivialise and dismiss what that person has just told you. I mean, I think in a way it's misplaced empathy, but it's important not to do it, even if it's coming from a good place, because it can actually be very hurtful. Because, as Luke Beardon says, nothing, to an extent that this statement has truth, there is nothing that an autistic person will display behaviour-wise that cannot be shared with a non-autistic person. So in that extent, you are a bit like that too, because autism is not behaviour. Autism is in the brain. And this is where the traits concept falls apart, because it is a myth that autistic traits such as lacking eye contact could be seen as an autistic trait. And this is because, do all autistic people lack eye contact? The answer is no. So if all autistic people don't lack eye contact, then how is lacking eye contact an autism trait? And conversely, many non-autistic people also struggle with eye contact, but are not autistic. So I thought that's a very good critique of the traits concept by Luke Beardon, and I would agree. Is lacking eye contact unique to autism? No. So therefore, it logically follows that it is not an autistic trait, because a trait is a distinguishing feature of something. And there is no one trait that distinguishes autism. So we can't really talk about autistic traits, because that implies that autism is behaviour when autism is not behaviour at all. Autism is a pattern of difficulties and possibly strengths that exist over time that might have behavioural manifestations, but it is not defined by that behaviour. And the reasons behind the traits might not be the same. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, saying, oh, I do that too, demeans autism. Someone who's not autistic might also struggle with eye contact, but it's likely for different reasons than an autistic person. Even if it was for the same reason as an autistic person, the level of issue that would cause will not be the same to the extent that it actually, impairs that person. But it's demeaning. It's demeaning. Autism is more than an isolated trait anyway. Another myth that Luke Beardon points out on page 39 is the myth that autistic children are unsociable. He says that the desire to engage at a social level is just as much, is as varied in autism as it is in non-autistics. And again, I would agree that autism is defined as a social difficulty in terms of making sense of, interpreting, making sense of and responding to the the social world around you, but that is not the same thing as your desire to interact. And Lorna Wing, I think it's Lorna Wing, actually talked about different groupings of autistic people: the aloof, the passive, and the active but odd. The active but odd sort of type of autistic person will very much want to interact with others, but will do so in a way that's a little bit on the odd side, particularly in childhood, before they might have learned how to mask. As a child, I was actually very sociable. I really wanted to the extent of actually talking to people on trains and actually going right up to complete strangers to talk to them. I was really sociable. I wanted to go to parties, for example. I was really upset when I couldn't go to the reception party that a child was having a reception because we were going on holiday, and I was saying to my mum, but I really wanted to go to the party. I wanted to socialise, but I did so in a really inappropriate way because I didn't know how to socialise properly, and I didn't know how to make friends. I was often on my own at school, not through choice, but because I didn't know how to interact with the other kids. But when the teacher found me a playmate, then I loved it, as long as as long as I was in control of the game. But the problem is I often fell out with other kids because I couldn't interact with them properly. But the desire was there. As I've got older, that desire has actually lessened because socialising has become even harder as an adult, and I think I'm more aware of my issues now as well, and I've got more anxiety and things like that, so I've become a lot more inhibited. But it's not the case that just because you're autistic, you're going to have a low social desire. That is mutually exclusive. So that's a myth, and it's a very important myth that needs to be busted. But as Luke Beardon says, if a child finds engaging with others difficult, they may choose not to do it, but that is not a lack of desire per se. So obviously, what you find difficult in life, it often dampens down desire. And as I said earlier, as I've grown up and I've developed more anxieties and the world's become even more complex, that's definitely lowered my desire to socialise. But that is largely because of how difficult it is to socialise, not because of any original lack of desire necessarily. And he suggests that there is such a thing as autistic sociability, so you can be autistic and be very sociable, but it's just going to look different to like non-autistic sociability, and that the predominant neurotype, the non-autistics, struggle to understand autistic sociability because it's different. And then he talks about the impairment model judges the population. The impairment model judges a population for being in a minority. So if you're in a minority, you're automatically judged as being lesser. And that is true. We need to get away from value judgments. Autism might carry certain difficulties, impairments if you want to call it that, but that doesn't make the autistic person, just because they're in a minority, inferior or abnormal, I think, and I would agree. So I'm going to finish now, but I will carry on reviewing this book next week because